Well, hello and welcome to this video tutorial brought to you by Tutvid.com. Today we're going to take a look at sky replacement for your photographs. So there's all kinds of instances where you would want to replace the sky in both landscape and portrait photography. Sometimes the weather just isn't cooperating, you're not getting the cloud pattern that you really want. And replacing the sky is like this instant shot in the arm for your photograph of drama and this surreal, sweeping landscape shot. It can take that shot that's pretty good and make it pretty incredible just by doing a little bit of a sky replacement. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different ways of doing sky replacements, all just in doing this one sky replacement here. I'm going to show you a few of the different things that I do, and you can really stop with your sky replacement at any step along the way, right where you like it. So the beginning of any sky replacement shot, you're going to need a photograph. So here's our starting image before any of the retouching, any of the craziness happens. And we're not going to cover all the retouching. We're going to cover the sky portion of this. But the first thing that you want to take into consideration when thinking about sky replacements is you need some kind of a library of skies to draw from. So start shooting clouds. Take your camera with you when you're out and about and shoot any cool clouds that you see. Now, I've noticed that typically what works best is just still look toward the horizon. Certainly don't look straight up into the sky at the clouds. That's not the way light works, and your clouds are always going to look kind of funky. It's going to be like looking at a wall of clouds instead of seeing these clouds that are naturally going in the sky. So definitely point your camera toward the horizon line and shoot your photos of the clouds that way. You can sort of tilt them into the sky a little bit, but not too much. And I've also noticed that wider angles are better. So like 24 millimeters on a full frame camera or wider, probably like 17 millimeters on a cropped frame or cropped sensor camera is probably about where you want to shoot. There's nothing that says you can't zoom in, but I've just noticed the best shots are the ones that are really sweeping. So that's just a couple things to keep in mind. Now, as far as the photographs that you're going to be placing the sky in, you probably want your photographs to be as sharp front to back as they can be. So you don't really want to try to replace the sky on an image where the background is way out of focus. It's going to be super difficult, and it's just going to look super weird because you're probably going to have a sky that's in focus when the rest of the background isn't. So just keep that in mind when you're doing stuff like this. So if you're shooting your own photographs, you probably want to shoot your landscape images and even portrait photography if you're doing location work and you have the strobe power to do it. F8, F11, F16, something like that. It all depends on the focal length of your lens, but just stuff to keep in mind when you're shooting, knowing, okay, later on down the road I might want to replace this sky. Or sometimes right off the bat, hey, the sky's just not what I want it to be. I'm going to need to replace the sky. And the other thing to take into consideration is this image versus sky idea. You don't want your sky to be doing anything but complementing the image. You don't want it to be sort of making the image look weird. So I wouldn't drag in an image of huge clouds, right, into this sunset picture here down in Norfolk, Virginia. It wouldn't look right. It would look very strange because it's not the weather for those kind of big poofy clouds. It just isn't the setting. It wouldn't quite look right. So I probably wouldn't do it. Now, maybe I would give it a shot and just see. Maybe it looks cool. But right off the bat, I'm just thinking about those kind of things when I look at the image. Now, before I even go and choose the sky, one of the things that I like to do is create the selection of the sky area in the image that's going to receive the new sky, which would be this big area. Now, this image is going to present us with a number of challenges, so let's get started with it. I'm going to grab the quick selection tool. Now, there's a million different ways you can create selections in Photoshop. You can use quick masks, which actually I love to do, and lately I've been doing a lot of selections with quick mask. There are the marquee tools and lasso tools and the pen tool and all kinds of different ways that you can create selections. So feel free to do whatever works best for your image, what you're most comfortable with. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a rough selection here of the sky, and I don't care about any of the details, not right now at least. So because this tutorial isn't necessarily one about selections, I'm just going to run over the selection stuff fairly quickly. Again, also because every photograph is different. I mean, you're going to have different challenges. You might have somebody with flowing hair, or you might have a guy that's completely bald. Two completely different scenarios. In this case, I've got some trees that are way off in the distance. I've got these light poles and these wires, and then lots of straight, easy to mask edges along this yacht. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in over here on an obvious problem area, right? The sky, we don't want it to cover up this little building. So I'm going to take my quick mask tool, hold down my Alt or Option key, and I'm just going to begin painting in here and just say, hey, look, grab that, and don't be ridiculous. Let let that breathe, so to speak. So there we go. We've got that. That looks good. And then we can go around like we know we're going to have to get that window eventually. We could probably even paint it in now and let Quick Mask do its thing. But all these little intricate details, this is where it starts to get tricky. And the same with these trees and things over here. So I'm going to show you kind of how I go about doing that. And then we'll quickly speed through exactly what the next step is going to be, because you can spend 10, 15, 20 minutes doing this depending on the image. So what I'm going to do now that I've got my selection to this point, you may think, well, hey, we can go select refine edge, right? Well, select refine edge is great, and it's an amazing tool, and Photoshop has so many incredible selection tools between channels and refine edge and the quick mask tools and things like that, but there still isn't one surefire, it's going to work every time, it's going to take 30 seconds, you're going to have a perfect selection kind of tool. I would imagine there's some plugins out there, but I still prefer just going in and doing it by hand. I don't know, it's just the way I've always done it, and it works, and I know it works, and I don't have to worry about it. So what I'm going to do is I've gotten my rough selection. I know that I need to go in there and get all these wires and things like that. So I'm going to enter the quick mask mode. We do that by hitting the letter Q. So what's happening now is we have this whole red overlay, and wherever is red, that is going to be selected. So what we can do is we can zoom in. I'm just going to come back here to the edge of the boat, and I'll show you how we tackle the tops of these tree lines a little bit later on. Right, so you can see here, we've got this little railing, right? So I'm just going to grab my brush tool, and I'm going to size my brush way down. Just using the bracket keys, right, until it's about the correct size. Make sure my opacity is set to 100, and I'm painting with white. So white's going to take away this pink stuff, which takes away the selection. There we go. We're no longer going to be selecting that little railing. All right, and then I do the same thing with this railing, and I'm just holding down the shift key and just shift clicking, right, so I can grab big chunks of this. I don't have to worry about holding my my mouse or my hand or my stylus straight. All right, and the same thing for this. I can just size the brush up till it's about the thickness of that little antenna. Boom, go up there and just go in and paint all that right away, right? So instead of making you watch me do all this, I have a selection already that I've created. But yeah, I would come in here, I would just hand paint all that in. It takes 30 seconds. It's a breeze. We're going to ignore these trees for now. We're going to get to them later. And yeah, that's pretty much how you're going to go about making your selections. So start with the selection tool of your choice, then go to the quick mask mode and refine, refine, refine. That's how the whole process works. And if you want to create something that looks great, just take the time to refine it and kind of get it right. So I'm going to get out of quick mask mode and deselect. Now what I've done is created this selection and saved it as a selection, or saved it as a channel down here, alpha 1. You can name it anything you want. So I'm going to go select, load selection, and from the channel I'm going to choose alpha 1 and hit OK. And here's my selection. So you can see I've got all the different lines and things selected, and it's a little bit faster than making you sit and watch me do everything by hand. So one thing that we don't have, as you can see, we've got a little bit of a rough selection around these signs, and we still don't have our trees. We're going to address all of that in a moment. But for now that we know we have our selection, let's get the sky in here. It's going to make our selection go away, but don't worry. We saved it as a channel, so we can always load it up again. So I'm going to jump out to bridge. Oh, by the way, here's a skies library, just different sky images that I've collected. Well, these just 130 of them, so not too many in this folder. But I've got a few different folders on different hard drives and things with just different images I've taken over the years. All right, so over here in this window, we have our sky image that I want to use. This one right here. Well, I'm not going to use this one. I'd rather use this one. It kind of goes with the color scheme of our image now, although really the colors can be pushed and pulled any which way you like. So it's a .cr2 file, which is the Canon RAW format. Don't worry about that. Just grab your file and drag it into Photoshop, and I'm going to drop it right on top of my image. All right, so the Camera Raw editor is going to pop up and say, hey, you want to change anything? Nah, I'm good. I'm just going to hit the OK button. It's going to prepare a smart object, and it's going to drop it in there. So I'm just going to move it down approximately into place and hit the check icon up here to commit my change. Now what I want to do, and I do this with almost every sky that I work with, I still want to play with the perspective of my clouds, so it really is going to more closely match what I've got going on. See, for instance, the image of the boat, it was shot on a wider angle lens than this image of the sky. And we've got some great perspective in the sky and great depth, certainly, as these clouds go off toward these little hills. But I still want there to be a little bit more drama. So I'm going to just roughly align this, and then I'm going to go Edit, Transform, Distort. And I do this a lot with my skies. Like I said, I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to begin by pulling these corners out. I don't really mind that I'm essentially sizing the image way up, mainly because you're going to see later on, a lot of times I end up blurring my skies. And even if I don't blur them, you're still usually going to use some kind of blend mode, which is going to kind of help ease that. And if you can still see blurriness, sometimes just adding a little bit of noise will work wonders. So I'm just going to adjust the perspective a little bit. Go ahead and hit the check icon. I'm hoping that these trees aren't going to appear in my mask, but I'll show you how we deal with that. If they do, it's really no big deal. We're going to go select, load selection, and load that alpha 1 channel. Hit OK. You can see we're definitely going to have trees in there. All right, so that's going to be a little bit of an issue. I'll show you how we tackle that. And we've got our smart object, our layer over here selected, and we can just hit the layer icon button, or we can go layer mask, reveal selection. All right, so now we have our sky dropped into place and masked, and it really doesn't look that bad. It kind of looks cool, actually. But you can see some obvious problems, such as these trees looming here around the building, which look like giant silhouettes of impending doom. So we want to get rid of them. So I'm going to select my layer thumbnail, right? We're not working on the mask, we're working on the layer. Hit Command or Control T to bring that up, bring up our image, and go distort. And I'm going to, oh, hold on. Before we do that, we want to unlink the layer from the layer mask. We want the layer mask to stay true, and we want to move our image kind of behind the layer mask. So I'm going to right click and hit distort again, and I'm just going to pull my image down a little bit, all right, to get rid of those trees. And to compensate for the perspective getting a little messed up again, I'm just going to expand the top even more, right? So I'm just going to kind of try to stretch this out a little bit more, maybe even pull it sideward a little bit to pull those trees out of frame a little, right? Kind of like that. I sort of like that sky. And then go ahead and commit that change. We've got a massive image that we're building here. So if your computer starts to slow down, don't freak out. And that looks like a fairly convincing sky for sort of an ocean type scene. It's not bad. Remember, we know that this used to be there, but the people who see this image for the first time, they don't know that that used to be there. So at this point, you could stop. You could stop right here and be okay with it. But I want to go a little bit further. I want to go in, and you can see we have some problem areas down here where we have some issues with our sky meeting up with the tree line. We have some trees that have completely disappeared, and some other issues over here. So there's a few different ways that I tackle these, and I really go for just, hey, I want to make it look believable. I don't care about being technically perfect. That's not what creating great photography is about. Some people may think it is, and some people may say it is, but it's not. Creating great photography that looks great, the operative word there is looks great, well, operative phrase. So we want it to look great more than anything else. And if that means we're not doing something that's technically perfect or pixel perfect, that's okay. So here's what I'm talking about. In order to get this to blend together, right, you would think, well, all right, you got to go in there and paint away all of the pixels that aren't right. Well, no, that's going to be far too time consuming. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to grab a decent sized brush, make sure the hardness is set to 0, and set the opacity of the brush down around 20%. Something where we have lots of control, and make sure we're painting with black. And then just click a couple times to sort of fade our new sky out right there at the base. Okay, so you can see we're fading our skies right together. And we have our tree line again. And we can do the same right over here. We can just fade our skies right together. And that kind of takes care of those scraggly trees. However, right in here, we can't do that. You can see if I shut the skies off, we're losing a lot of our trees. Actually, around this tree, I probably can get away with it. Let's see here. Size my brush down a little bit, yeah, and that's not too bad. I don't mind doing that at all. But for these trees here, we're going to take a different approach. I'm actually going to shut my sky layer off, and we're going to try to select these trees as best we can. So this is where we're going to use the Refine Edge command. So grab something like your quick selection tool, okay? And we're just going to paint a quick rough selection over these trees. Now, a couple things that I should mention about this tool that I'm using here, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key, Alt or Option key, and just get rid of that little sign. One of the things about the tool that I'm using, notice I'm on my original layer, which I've named Healings, but that's just because I did some healing work on it before this tutorial started. I have this not sampling all layers. It's only sampling the layer I'm on. So just something to keep in mind if you're working in a layer where you have multiple, or if you're working in a document with multiple layers. Right now we don't need to worry about that. All of our other layers are shut off, so it's no issue at all. But something to keep in mind. I'm on this layer. I'm only sampling from this layer. Now that we have this selection, we're going to go Select, Refine Edge, and we're going to tick on Smart Radius. And then we're going to expand the radius a little bit, so maybe like 2 or 3 pixels, something like so. The important thing here is the Refine Radius tool. It's this brush tool. We're going to grab that, and I'm going to start painting, and I want to take in some of the sky as I paint. All right? And you're going to see it's going to dump most of our selection, and that's fine. Let this tool do its work. Just make sure you're giving it sky to sample from, right? You're going to see it's wiping away a ton of this. I love it though. All right, there we go. And that's really going to do some damage, but that's great. Love it. It's great. It's awesome. Go ahead and hit OK, and we have this really fine selection, and it looks like we're selecting way too much, but there's varying degrees of opacity that are being selected, so it's much less than you're thinking. I'm going to turn the sky back on. I'm going to select my layer mask, and I'm going to fill this with black, right, because we're blocking out the new sky, so we're filling this selection in our mask with black. So Alt backspace, Option delete on the Mac, and hit Command or Control D to deselect. And you can see we've got our trees back. Now at that point you could go and you could really play with the selection a little bit more and fine tune the edges a little more if you wanted with the brush tool, but I'm not going to take the time to do that. We're going to try to fly through this a little bit here. So right now is where you could stop, right? So if you take maybe a curves adjustment layer for your healings or your base layer, right? So if I drop in a curves adjustment here and we fill in some red and yellow on the bottom, maybe decrease the contrast just a touch so it matches the sky. Go ahead and pour some red into there, a little bit of red I guess, and then some yellow. Oh, too much yellow. Something like that, okay, and then really give it some good color with either a photo filter, something like, maybe not quite a photo filter, maybe something like a color balance adjustment layer or a nice gradient map, something like that. All right, so we can go here, increase the magenta a little bit, increase the yellow just a little bit, increase the red a bunch. We go to the highlights, pour a little bit of yellow, but mainly red, well, a little bit of red, a little bit of magenta into those highlights, and the same with shadows, okay, so you can sort of see we're making some crazy difference here. Reduce the opacity a little bit until it looks about right, and there you go. So you could kind of be content with that image if you wanted. I'm not going to do that though. We're going to kind of go a step further. We're going to get a little crazier with this. So like I said, we're going to explore a variety of different ways you can play with sky replacements in Photoshop. So what we're going to do here is this image, or this layer I should say, is still a smart object. In order to do what we want to do to it next, we need to rasterize it. So we're going to do that by going Layer, Smart Objects, Rasterize. You can also, by the way, right-click on the layer and choose Rasterize Layer. You have to actually right-click on the layer, not the layer mask. So you can see, there we go, no longer a smart object. And this is important because we want to go ahead and blur this layer to imply motion. Almost imply that this is a long exposure shot, and it's a really cool way to take almost any picture of the sky that you have and turn it into something kind of special. Again, depending on the look you're going for, you might hate it, but you might love it. So what we're going to do, select this layer, and I'm going to Control click or Command click my mask to load that as a selection, right? We only want to blur the sky within our selection here. But really, the real reason for doing this, I'm going to show you, is something that's going to happen here in a moment. We're going to go Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. And we're going to set our radial blur amount to 40, something like that. Again, this is going to be something where you just kind of have to play with it and see what you like. All right, now default is spin. We want to set this to zoom. So I know that I want 40 for this image, and I want to set the blur method to zoom. You're probably never going to use spin, almost never at least, in this type of application. Now, this is interesting. You can see this looks like a little 3D mock-up almost of how the zooming is going to be applied to our image. Now, remember way back at the beginning of this tutorial I talked about shooting your clouds with a wide-angle lens. Well, shooting clouds with a wide-angle lens sort of accentuates this feeling of movement in the clouds, and the clouds always seem like they're moving toward a set point in the horizon. Now, I happen to know that the sun was setting somewhere right over here in the sky, so I want my clouds to sort of be racing toward the sunset. So this little blur center box is only respecting our selection. This is why I made this selection, because I know if I tuck my zoom way down in this corner, it's not going to zoom from this corner of the image, but rather this corner of my selection. All right, so we're going to go ahead and drop that in there. Okay, so just imagine that sort of flat line there as being almost our horizon line. The clouds are all racing down from the top toward the sunset. Hit OK, and give Photoshop a second, and you can see, whoop, zoomed in on me there, that we have this kind of cool effect here for our clouds. I'm going to deselect my selection, Command or Control D, and you can see what we've got. There's our mask. I just Alt-clicked. You can Option-click on that to view your mask, make sure everything's intact and doing well. And there we have it. We have our blurred sky. Now, at this point, this layer is it's a little too powerful for me. I want it to blend with the sky, and something that I not almost always do, I always do it is set my skies to various blend modes, because we have this great gradation of color in the sky. Let's take advantage of that and, you know, add to the realism of our new sky. So we can try things like the multiply blend mode, color burn. Now this is going to be a little crazy just because of the light in the sky versus light in the foreground, as well as the obvious saturation. But something like soft light might look pretty cool, right? So there's before, there's after. So it's this subtle pop we're adding to the sky, and I really like it. It's doing a whole lot for this image. Now, what I do want to do before we finish this up is I want to be able to see a little bit more of the sky than we're seeing. So I'm going to boost the contrast of it, and we can do this a whole number of ways. I'm going to just throw a curves adjustment layer on it. So layer, new adjustment layer, curves. And we're just going to tick on use previous layer to create clipping mask. Hit OK. That's great. And I'm going to now begin playing with this and just pulling down. What I'm really trying to do is we sort of have these streaks of light. I want those to get brighter, and I want these sort of bellies of darker light to get darker, right? So not just a wholesale contrast adjustment, but really trying to fine tune this a little bit. All right, something like so. And probably what I would end up doing is going in with some dodging and burning and really bringing them out. Not to the point where they're cartoon looking, but you know, really just helping to make them pop a little bit more. And then we can also go and just add some color if we like, right? So I'm going to bring some cyan into the darker patches and make sure the highlights are still definitely very red. Bring some magenta into the highlights and maybe leave the shadows or the darker areas up there in the sky a little bit more green. And then for the blue, we'll probably just add a little bit of yellow to the highlights, and then bring the blues back in to those bellies, because the blues and the magentas really kind of mingle together to create this really beautiful sunset color. It's almost this pinkish color that we've got going on. Really, really kind of cool. So there we go. There's before the curves, there's after the curves. So a little bit of a contrast and color pop. We may have blurred our layer a little bit too much, but I kind of like it. So there we go. You would probably go in and touch up those clouds back there if you really wanted to make this a convincing long exposure shot, as well as add some blur to the water. So after that, you can just finish retouching your image. You can see I threw sort of a sun in there. I did blur the water. I went in, did a little bit of dodging and burning, like I said, to the sky, as well as cleaned up the clouds issues down in the corner. And just like that, you can go in and replace the sky on almost any image, whether you've got a person in it or whether it's a landscape with a rigid mountaintop you're masking to. Anything can benefit from a great sky being placed in it when you haven't gotten a great sky showing up, you know, on location and shooting when you do. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching it. Make sure you go check out the website. That's www.tutvid.com for more free video tutorials. Thanks so much for watching.